And the mayor? What did the mayor do? Hello and welcome to All Comics Considered, the comic book podcast with the heart of gold. This week, it's just Marty and Nick, like the good old days at Beloit, holding hands at Gen Con. And we are going to talk about some milestones of comics, ones that we've read, ones that we have not read, and then we're going to debate about another, if it should be one.
Man, you know that was over 20 years ago?
God, no. God, thanks. Actually, I lied, everybody. It's not just me and Nick. It's me, Nick, and Eugene Debs, Robust Porter, because I'm so old I have to drink stouts to stay alive. Yeah, that was still at Indy, so it was the early days of Indy.
Yeah, man.
So, Nick, when we were tossing out ideas for the show, we had this idea of like milestones. How would you define a milestone comic?
I would say a comic that gives you access to a piece of the zeitgeist that you didn't have before. So when you think about it, what media really is a method of communication between people, right? You and I have seen the same movie, so suddenly our language, becomes broader as we use quotes and scenes from the movie to expand, the methods in which we can communicate with one another.
Yeah,
that's all nerdery really is just a shared set of memes. And I would say a milestone comic is something that gives you access to kind of an interstate of communication rather than just a private road, if that makes sense.
I think that's a really good to pull from Tim, like a really good ivory tower to ground floor kind of explanation. Like, milestone comics are those that capture the moment so well, they communicate the moment for a very long time, and they bring you in even if you didn't experience it.
Yep.
So one note, I agree with this definition. Just one note, like I'm looking at my list, and it is problematic in that it is mostly white dudes again. So I'm immediately going to scream for my listeners to help educate us on like comics that are not just by straight white guys. Like there are so many bajillions of these books. There's one that isn't, but like this is an area that I really want to grow. But when I think about milestone comics, I think these are some of the ones that definitely in the big two are there. And I feel like it's still a highway of the time of it's still a highway of the era, but it's not a super highway because it's only like a 2-car highway. It needs to be more. Does that make sense? Am I torturing your beautiful analogy? I'm down for torturing analogies, by the way. I am the John Yu of torturing analogies. And what makes that funny is that, never mind. We're going to talk about John Yu, who is not funny. Anyway. So let's get started. Let's start with the milestones that we have read. Because I think that you will never be able to read all of the books. But what are some of the big touchstone milestone books that you have read?
Oh, the ones that I have read. Boy, I didn't even think about that. Bone, definitely.
Yes.
Um, this kind of pains me um, pretty deeply, but Cerberus.
Okay. Okay.
Uh,
Why does it pain you?
um,
Like, because we've talked about it, but like, explain
this
this.
is an angry comic. It is a lot of it, and the viewpoints expressed in it sort of echo Red Pill Society before that was a thing. This is a very angry comic written by a very angry person. At least that I presume. I've certainly never met the guy. The guy, but
Those are those are two big indie books. And in this case, indie just meaning not one of the big two. Um,
yeah, Transmet.
oh, of course, yeah. Transmet is like I I love Warren Ellis, but nothing has been as amazing to me as Transmet. It feels like it's his magnum opus.
I agree. Sandman.
Yeah.
Civil War.
Yeah, that's interesting. So as we're listing all these things, a couple of the indie books. Who was the writer artist on Cerebus?
Dave Sims.
And he was the writer and artist on the book.
Okay. I think so.
What's interesting about some of the other books as we come to talk about them, in the sense that, like, interesting in the sense that we are talking about the comic industry. Sandman, there are a ton of creatives on that book, from Karen Berger as the editor down to the colorists and letterers who craft this epic story of whether you accept change or you die. Where does art factor in terms of milestones then, from the ones that you're talking about? Like, how important, like, was it overly sized important, or was it just regular comic book level importance? Because I have a theory.
Boy, I'm not a good person to ask. I'm a writer, so I read for the story more than the art. Like, I appreciate the art, but to be honest, it's more of a conveyance for story for me than it is my primary draw.
And so I'm going to interject one of my red milestones as why it's super important. The art is super important. Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. And I'm thinking of the comic issue where he's in space, which was a thing. Swamp Thing in space. But there is a whole sequence of him where it's all blue. And it is a gorgeous book that is super deep in, like, not just DC's mythos and what they're building, but in My Blue Heaven, he's recreated the whole world in blue, including Abby, including some of the villains. And then he goes into a horror scene as he's trying to get back to Earth. But the coloring, where everything is blue, it's a little heavy-handed, but it's still just a wonderful use of the art. And this is why I think, for me, the milestone, like, oh my God, the artist on Transmet was the same artist throughout the whole time. It wasn't Steve Dillon. Name is escaping me. But the artist on Transmet was the artist on Transmet. So
there were a couple of, like, weird issues that had some other art,
which is pretty common. I mean, like, Garth Ennis's Preacher was mostly all Steve Dillon, but there's a couple by others. But it was Ellis and Robertson, like, and I think Robertson hasn't been better, right? Like it was the pinnacle of his game, and I feel like for a number of these books, like even Bone, when we talked about Bone, there is something about the art style that is absolutely perfectly capturing the story that is being told. And I think that for a milestone comic, the art can't be just okay. The art has to be astounding and to be an equal footing within the story. I mean, sometimes we get books that are more eye candy than story, and sometimes we get more books that are way too much story and not relying on the artist to do the art. And I kind of feel like once you get that sweet spot of writer and artist and letterer and colorist all working in tandem, you get something that truly captures the moment in a way that prose can, but there's something because of the art that gives comic the edge, in my undereducated and relatively humble opinion. And I'm going to take your silence as that you agree with me on that one. I'm just going to read into it whatever I want.
I'm sorry, man. I got distracted by some dark thoughts.
Oh,
in the middle of that. I don't know what it was, but something that you said just triggered a dark train of thought.
Well, don't tell my bosses, because they'll be like, well, clearly you can't do motivational interviewing anymore because you made your co-host think dark thoughts with My Blue Heaven. Although, Swamp Thing is a horror book at times, so okay. Now, what about those milestones that you haven't read?
So it's been on my shelf. There's a film out. I really need to watch it and read it. But Persepolis. I think that's an important book that will give me. It will open a door for me, in terms of having a better understanding of some of the shit that's happened in the world,
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I have picked it up and put it down half a dozen times, and I think I just need to make the time and the space to read this particular book.
So I have read just almost my whole life exclusively fantasy novels about white guys, written by white guys, occasionally white women. Mm-hmm. Saladin Ahmed writes from a different perspective, and I own half of the shit that he's ever written, and I've read zero of it. Never for any particular reason, just because I don't know, I feel depressed, so I don't read a book. I hardly read anymore because I'm so scared of characters facing conflict that that will make me feel bad. That it's hard for me even to read anything that has any kind of serious emotional engagement.
Man, I totally get that. After my, I've talked about it before on the show, but my first round of depression, I couldn't read anything because, nothing mattered. Everything was awful. I miss my mom and dad. But yeah, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, the first book I read after my mom died. And then immediately after I finished it, I started crying because I wanted to talk to my mom about that book. We would exchange books in my family. So, yeah. Yeah, when you're depressed and you have and you're climbing out of it, you've such a tenuous hold, any little thing, emotional conflict. And with a writer like Saladin, yeah, you're going to get it. He's one of my favorites. I love him. I could talk about the most recent book of his that I read, comic book that I read of his, Miles Morales, The End. And he did a really good job, and I understand the art. It wasn't perfect for me, but who cares what I think about the art? Not every comic is for me that way, but the story was great. Anyway, enough about Saladin and me fanboying over Saladin. One day, I hope to meet him.
So that's the thing. Everybody does that. Everybody I talk to does that. I just have not cracked open the stuff that I've bought. I've paid money for this, and I just haven't read it.
Mm-hmm. His
similarly,
the Crescent Moon series.
Yeah, I own it, man.
It's okay, man. I give him $4 on Patreon every month to keep creating stories for me, so it's good.
Like
You're fine.
my Kindle is like, I'm sure it's on page 2 because I've opened it like 5 times.
I think you'll really like it, but yeah.
Similarly, Will Eisner. I've never read any Will Eisner. He's incredibly foundational to comics, to the way that comics are built, essentially.
Yeah. It has been a long time since I've read his Spirit, and I don't remember where I read it. But it's been so long that it might as well be a whole new read for me.
Strangers in Paradise and Love and Rockets. Never read any of those.
All right, we're gonna find out if Tim listens to the show. He bought me Love and Rockets graphic novel, and it is on my shelf, and I have yet to finish reading it. I've flipped through it. I've read whole pages, but I've not sat down to finish the book. Like, mostly because partly it was like I was trying to keep up with all the new stuff, and there's part of me that is, it's the same thing. You fall into your media trap, and so that's where I've been living for 40 odd some years. So it's time to get out of my trap. So I got to find it and finish it. But it's all over the place because we're moving dressers and never buy a house, never remodel, just live in a hole. Just pile your comics up and live in a hole. Anyway, but download the podcast and buy our t-shirts. So, all right. So, Strangers in Paradise, Love and Rockets.
Yeah, and of all of the big DC books, I've never read a single issue of Green Lantern.
Now, why? What are the milestone Green Lantern books like?
So, Darkest Day, definitely.
Okay.
The Death of Hal Jordan, probably.
Oh, the Death of Hal Jordan is like the Parallax era, so I don't think you're missing much.
Yeah.
But the 1970s Green Lantern, Green Arrow crossover books where Speedy becomes addicted to heroin.
Yeah, I'm gonna pass on those. I mean, that is definitely a milestone book, though.
Yeah, for multiple reasons. They were challenged by the Comics Code Authority, and it was a thing. Okay,
yeah.
Currently,
I'm actually not sure what a good recommended. I know so little actually about Green Lantern, really, that I'm not even sure what the recommended stories would be.
So, the run hasn't finished yet. There's 9 months left, but N.K. Jemisin is writing a Green Lantern comic.
Oh man.
Have you?
I've read The Broken Earth, man. That was beyond good.
Yeah, it's so N.K. Jemisin, the Broken Earth trilogy. She won the Nebula. Was the Nebula?
The Hugo. Yeah, she won the Hugo 3 years running, each in succession. Every time the book was released.
She won because she blows your goddamn mind. The world building, the characterization, working in concert with each other. It was such a visual book too. Her prose is beautiful and vivid. And they're going to make movies. I think it's movies or TV out of the Broken Earth series. But DC's Young Animal imprint, which is in some ways maybe the new Vertigo, they tapped her to write a Green Lantern story. So it's amazing, beautifully drawn. I am not prepared to talk about it in a pull box, but this might be the milestone Green Lantern book you're looking for.
She world builds like Brandon Sanderson and writes like Toni Morrison.
It's amazing how much talent she has. It makes if she wasn't so good, I would be angry. She's too good to be angry at.
So I'm reading a novel right now that I hope gets turned into a comic book someday. It's called Jade City by Fonda Lee.
Oh, Fonda Lee, who just signed a contract to write some more books for Marvel.
Oh, really?
Yes, off the top of my head, I don't remember what she's writing.
Um, just given what I'm reading right now, I hope it's Shang-Chi.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's a novel. It's like The Godfather set in a 50s fantasy Asian city, just after the end of their equivalent of World War II.
Oh, wow.
And it is about essentially the gangs that control the city in a Godfather-esque way. Um, except they also mine jade on the island, and the jade is magic, and holding it gives you magic kung fu powers. It is a very rad book.
That's awesome. So Fonda Lee is currently writing, as of September 2019, she was writing Swordmaster. She might be writing more, and Agents of Atlas. So, yeah, I want her to get more Marvel books or more books.
It's The Godfather as by John Woo.
Uh, there's also a thing about she will be writing an Iron Man book in March 2020.
She's very talented, man.
Yeah, I will have to check out Swordmaster on Marvel Unlimited. It should be out by now.
Ruben, I believe, knows her.
He does. Well, Ruben, friend of the show, who is an amazing karaoke singer and a writer in his own right, and a good socialist friend of ours. He met her at Viable Paradise and does cons and stuff. And Ruben was formerly on the Dorcadia podcast, who would be our sister show, but they don't want to be related to us. Maybe because of something I said about Dorcadia After Dark, but that's a insider baseball for podcasts, so who cares? Yeah, Ruben knows her and has talked about her before, and is very excited about her Marvel work. That's awesome. So I'm going to share some of what I think are some great milestone comics, and I'm going to start with the ones that I have read. Now, I've jumped in and interrupted you a handful of times, Nick, so I'll just share the ones that the two that I have read and defend them like they were my own. First and foremost, among them all is Alan Moore's Swamp Thing.
Honestly, that's a book that I should read.
Because wait till you're ready for it, because it does summarize like Thatcherism, Reaganism, the 80s, like the horror of the end of the atomic age and the supply side economics and identity and psychedelics. It's gorgeous. It's one of the reasons. It's, again, like I said, My Blue Heaven is one of the reasons why the art matters. It's also a milestone in the horror and superhero and big twos genre, because it is a really masterful reset and reboot, a reset of the character. It's not a reboot, but prior to Alan Moore, Lev Weissman was saying that our hero, the Swamp Thing, was part plant, part man, and blah, blah, blah. And Alan Moore, in the autopsy of Swamp Thing, which is the first issue, is like, no, he's not a human. He's all plant. Like, we don't know what this is. And he goes on to set up stories that continue to pay off to this day. The creation of the Green, John Constantine.
He basically is largely responsible for creating the mystic mythos of DC, like wholesale.
Yeah,
like him and Gaiman.
Yeah, they create this story, and this is like, we're not going to get multi-year runs on comics anymore, except when we do, like with Jason Aaron on Thor. But this is a book that inspired Vertigo. Vertigo is what inspired most of the comic creators today. And the next generation of comic book creators are going to be reading books that we are lucky to get like at a monthly pace right now. Like I'm saying it now. Hoxpox is a milestone in comic storybook telling. Like, bar none. It may be 6 months over, but you're not going to change my mind. And I think it's going to be as influential as Swamp Thing was, mostly because it hits the criteria of it's encapsulating the era. It's also doing amazing stuff with the property, and it's also creating more interest within the property itself.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Hoxpox?
Yeah.
House of X, Powers of 10.
Oh God. Okay.
The Hickman books.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Now I understand what you're talking about. I've never heard anyone use that term before. Yeah.
I'm going to blame our guest Adam and his friend Zach from the X-Men podcast, Battle of the Atom, which is a great name for a show. It's their fault that I call it Hoxpox because it is pretty great. But yeah, Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. It is along with V for Vendetta, which and a handful of other books. It is the comic book that gave, in some regards, a permission for comics to get darker and to get more darker, realistic, and then psychedelic. It is permission to delve into non-comics code approved subject.
Yeah, I mean it's comics with a dash of oh man, my mind just went freaking blank. Ginsberg.
Yeah.
Comics with a dash of Ginsberg.
That is 100% Alan Moore Swamp Thing. We already talked about Love and Rockets, but that's on my list of not reads. My next milestone, and maybe feel free to call me out on this, listeners, if you think I'm fanboying too much, but I am arguing that Hickman's Secret War is another milestone comic. Here is why. This series is the culmination of 9 years of work at Marvel. During the early peak of the MCU, it influences heavily the MCU. The art is phenomenal. The storytelling of Secret War is great. We get some of the best. We literally get world building as Doom, God Emperor Doom, the best version of Doom, rebuilds the world. And it just resets the tone of the Marvel Universe. Not a reboot, but it combines everything and brings in Miles to and other Ultimates Universe characters and sets up Al Ewing to do another possible milestone, Immortal Hulk. And the only reason why I haven't said Immortal Hulk as a milestone book is because we talk about it all the time, so it should be understood that Immortal Hulk is a milestone. But we'll leave that for if we can get Al Ewing on the show to talk about.
I'm not going to argue that Secret War is not a milestone book, but I don't think that Secret War on its own is a milestone book. I think you have to include the entire arc that's starting with, at the very least, the Fantastic Four, if not a little bit before.
Yeah.
The Council of Reeds, I think you at least have to go
the Councils
back
of Reeds. Yeah. You're you're arguing for an expansive definition of milestone. So
I think that specifically is a milestone because of the vastness of the effort.
Yeah.
It was I would consider that a monumental achievement in comics. That many arcs, all building to the same conclusion. And pulling it off successfully and actually sticking the landing,
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it is the most expansive definition, but I think, Hickman may not be your cup of tea, but if Hickman is your cup of tea, then this is the arc for you to read.
I would argue that if you start at the beginning of that arc and you read all the way to the end, you will have a different understanding of comics than you did before you read it.
I have to agree. I have to agree. So now that we've gushed and we've admitted our nerdery and we've patted ourselves on the back for doing that, now let me talk about my great shames. First and foremost, I didn't finish Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is a milestone in DC because it's a major reboot, one that was recently reset because of the work that was done.
We've talked about book clubbing that.
Yeah, and that's why I was reading it, but then I didn't finish it. Not because I wasn't interested, but because like the thing with the Crisis on Infinite Earths is there was so like it would. I think the argument about why Secret War as a standalone couldn't be a milestone. If you just pick up issue 1 of Secret War and read what's going on, you're going to be lost.
Yep.
And it's the same thing with Crisis. I was lost. It took me a long time to figure out like who was who, and it was like two screening it. I got it on my iPad on DC Unlimited, and then like my phone's open up to Wikipedia, like looking up like who are these fucking characters, like who is the Monitor, who is the Anti-Monitor, who is this woman that just betrayed the Monitor for the Anti-Monitor? Like, spoiler, people die. But it is a comic that I intend on going back to, starting with issue 1 and just finishing it all. The thing is, I read the Alan Moore Swamp Thing tie-ins to Crisis, and I didn't need to know anything about the Crisis for Alan Moore's Swamp Thing Crisis, and it was a beautiful tie-in that way. And that's I don't know why I was expecting, like, because I read Swamp Thing for it to make more sense than what it did. It was dumb. Okay. And this is where the X-Men fans that we have are going to make, will say that I'm not an X-Men fan. I have never read the Dark Phoenix saga.
It's funny. I actually read that in Beloit when I was staying at Beloit in Russian House, one incredibly hot and balmy summer in Wisconsin. I was staying in Russian House. I checked out those big blue bound giant X-Men collections that Marvel puts out sometimes.
Yep.
I checked out every one of those that Beloit Public Library had, and the Dark Phoenix saga happened to be in there.
Oh, wow. And what was your take on the Dark Phoenix saga?
It's good classic X-Men, you have to read it from the perspective of understanding that this was the first time, because we've seen the stories told so many times badly.
Yeah.
And a bunch of stories in comics afterwards that echoed it. It was the first time that particular story was told in comics. So you have to kind of try to read it from fresh eyes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know our friends at Battle of the Atom say it is the greatest story of all time, greatest X-Men story of all time. It's number 1. So I want to give it a read, clearly. But this is like Dark Phoenix is so mythic. Not in the sense of like Marvel mythos, but literally in the sense of like this is the ultimate in X-Men storytelling. And I'm like, well, what if I don't like it? Which is, who gives a shit if I don't like it? Like, it doesn't matter. It is like, it'll be the first time I get to read it, which will be cool for me. And if I don't like it, it doesn't matter. That doesn't mean it's a bad story. It just means I didn't care for it. And part of the problem with that is like, I have waited so long to read Dark Phoenix. Like, I've read a lot of Claremont afterward that I was not a fan of. And this is post X-Men.
It's dated, Claremont. Man. You gotta, it's definitely dated.
Yeah. And like, maybe if, I was still thinking like a history guy, I could get back in that mindset.
My advice is don't start right at Dark Phoenix. Start a couple of stories before that.
I think that's a good call. Like I'll start with I'll start with that. And then knowing that like what Claremont wanted to do with retiring X-Men and moving people on, that does paint the picture, but I think I just got to just read the text and not read the sausage making of it all. And so those are some of my big milestones. Crisis, Dark Phoenix, Love and Rockets, Alan Moore, which we talked about, and I'm not going to bring up my shame again, Swamp Thing, and the entirety of Hickman's first run at Marvel, from Fantastic Four to the end of Secret War. We have an upcoming episode where Nick and I will have a quick debate about a new milestone comic. This has been All Comics Considered, the comic book podcast with the heart of gold. And if you like what you've heard today, the number one thing you could do to keep the show going is to share us. Share us with your friends, your family, your coworkers. Also, share us on your social media feeds, whether it is Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram. I don't know how you would share us on Instagram. We're a podcast, but we've got artwork on our webpage, so share it and credit our wonderful art people. Now, if you really want to go above and beyond, the best thing you can do then is, in addition to sharing, join our Patreon. You'll get the show a little bit earlier. You'll find out some behind-the-scenes stuff. Eventually, you'll get an update when Tim and I will be doing a game off, which we'll talk more about on Patreon itself. Speaking of which, if anybody has a free half liver to donate to me, because given what Tim is making me do, I might need a new liver. And then we also have merch now. You can wear our logo as a hat, put it on your laptop as a sweatshirt. And there's a new design that's incoming. I just got to figure out how to blend the shapes a little bit better. But really, sharing us, talking about us, that listeners, is more than enough for us, because it just means that you care about us and the mission of All Comics Considered, of like kicking down those gates and bringing everyone into the warmth that is comic books. I have been one of your hosts, Marty. I am on Twitter at Officer Gleason, and I'm on some other podcasts, but I guess they're on hiatus, so maybe you'll hear me somewhere else.
I'm legally Nick Fury.
And until next time, podcast listeners, the greatest thing about not reading a milestone comic is that when you get to finally sit down and read one, you get to read a pretty awesome book. And I am jealous that you get to read that for the first time.